There's a particular kind of social interaction that makes certain people want to crawl out of their skin. It's not shyness, it's not rudeness, it's something deeper, almost visceral. When someone approaches them with cheerful comments about the weather, asks how their weekend was, or makes pleasant observations about nothing in particular, these individuals experience something approaching physical pain. They smile politely, they respond appropriately, but inside they're screaming or completely shutting down. Small talk doesn't just bore them, it actively drains them, leaving them exhausted and irritable in ways that seem completely disproportionate to what just happened. Other people manage these interactions effortlessly, even enjoy them, building rapport and social connection through this light conversational dance. But for certain individuals, small talk feels like torture, like being forced to speak a language that makes no sense, like wasting precious life energy on meaningless verbal exchanges that go nowhere and accomplish nothing. So why can't you stand small talk? What is it about your psychological makeup that makes superficial conversation so unbearable? And what can Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who himself found much social interaction draining and who developed a sophisticated understanding of personality types, teach us about why certain people are constitutionally incapable of tolerating surface-level conversation? To understand this, we need to start with Jung's revolutionary concept of introversion and what it actually means. Jung didn't define introversion as shyness or social anxiety. He defined it as a fundamental orientation of psychic energy toward the inner subjective world. For introverts, Jung explained, reality is primarily internal. External events and interactions are real, but they're experienced through the lens of internal response and reflection. Here's what's crucial about small talk and introversion. Small talk is entirely externally focused. It's about the surface, the objective, the shared external reality. Weather, weekend activities, neutral observations, these are all external objective content requiring no internal depth or subjective response. For deep introverts, this external-only focus is exhausting and meaningless. Their natural orientation is inward, toward subjective response, internal meaning, personal significance. Small talk forces them to operate purely externally against their natural energy flow, without accessing the internal dimension that makes conversation meaningful to them. Jung himself wrote about this, describing how engaging in conversation often feels like a struggle, and how he required extended periods of quiet to recuperate from the emptiness of spoken words. People who can't stand small talk are often deep introverts, for whom the externally focused nature of surface conversation violates their fundamental orientation and exhausts them by forcing sustained external focus without internal depth. There's also something profound about what Jung called the intuitive function and its relationship to conversation. Jung identified 4 primary psychological functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Intuition, Jung explained, perceives possibilities, patterns, and meanings beyond what's immediately visible. For people whose dominant function is intuition, conversation is meaningful only when it accesses these deeper patterns and possibilities. Small talk is the opposite of intuitive engagement. It's focused on concrete, immediate reality, on sensory facts, on what's literally present. There are no patterns to perceive, no deeper meanings to explore, no possibilities to imagine. It's pure sensation function content, which for intuitive types is the least developed and least interesting function. When you can't stand small talk, you're often an intuitive type whose dominant function finds no material to work with in surface conversation. The weather is the weather. The weekend happened. These facts don't lead anywhere, don't reveal patterns, don't open possibilities. For intuitive types, this kind of conversation feels like being asked to use only your weakest capacity, while your strongest capacity sits idle and frustrated. Jung himself was likely an introverted, intuitive type, which explains his difficulty with ordinary social conversation and his preference for discussions of depth and meaning. Let's also consider what Jung understood about energy economy and why small talk is particularly draining. Jung viewed the psyche as an energy system where different activities either generate or consume energy. For introverts, external interaction consumes energy that can only be restored through solitude. But not all external interaction is equally draining. Meaningful conversation, even for introverts, can be energizing because it engages them deeply, activates their dominant functions, creates genuine connection. Small talk, however, is maximally draining because it requires external effort without any of the rewards that make social interaction worthwhile. You must expend energy maintaining external focus, monitoring social appropriateness, generating responses, and performing interest. But you receive nothing in return. No genuine connection, no meaningful content, no engagement of your actual capacities. People who can't stand small talk have often recognized, consciously or unconsciously, that it's a terrible energy bargain. They're spending precious, finite energy on interaction that gives them nothing back, leaving them depleted without any of the nourishment that meaningful interaction provides. One commenter on Jung's experience with introversion noted, "Small talk, immensely futile waste of time and energy." This isn't about being antisocial. It's about recognizing that small talk is energy theft without compensation, and for people with limited social energy, it's unbearable. There's also something crucial about what Jung called depth and the introverted intuitive's orientation toward it. Jung recognized that different types engage reality at different depths. Some people are comfortable on the surface, dealing with immediate practical reality, concrete facts, and literal meanings, but others, particularly introverted intuitives, are oriented toward depth. They instinctively dive beneath surfaces, seeking the meanings, patterns, and significances that lie below obvious appearances. Research on introverted intuitives describes them as deep divers, who naturally explore psychological and conceptual depths. Small talk keeps you on the surface, deliberately avoiding depth, staying in the shallow end, where everyone is comfortable and nothing meaningful is risked. For depth-oriented people, this forced superficiality is torturous. They're being held in the shallowest possible water when their entire orientation is toward deep diving. They can physically manage it, but it feels fundamentally wrong, like being constantly prevented from doing what they're built for. When you can't stand small talk, you're often someone whose psychological orientation is toward depth, and surface conversation feels like being forced to breathe shallow breaths when you need deep breathing to feel alive. Jung also understood something about what he called the persona, and how small talk is essentially persona performance without substance. The persona is the social mask we wear to navigate public life. Some amount of persona is necessary and healthy, but problems arise when persona performance becomes disconnected from authentic self. Small talk is pure persona performance. You're not speaking from your authentic self, your real thoughts, your genuine feelings. You're performing the social ritual of pleasant surface exchange, saying things that are expected rather than things that matter. For people who already find persona performance draining or who have large gaps between their persona and authentic self, small talk is particularly unbearable. It's all mask, no substance. You're entirely in performance mode, with no opportunity for authentic expression or genuine connection. People who can't stand small talk often have strong needs for authenticity in communication. They can tolerate persona performance when it serves genuine connection or meaningful purpose, but persona performance for its own sake, which is what small talk is, feels intolerable to them. Jung himself struggled with the social masks that Swiss society demanded, finding them exhausting and alienating from his authentic self. There's also something significant about what Jung called meaning and the introverted intuitive's orientation toward it. Jung recognized that humans have an innate need for meaning, but different types satisfy this need differently. Introverted intuitives are particularly oriented toward meaning, constantly seeking significance, purpose, and deeper understanding. Every interaction, every experience, every conversation is unconsciously evaluated for its meaning content. Small talk has no meaning content. It's deliberately meaningless, designed to be safe, neutral, and insignificant. This absence of meaning is precisely what makes certain types unable to tolerate it. They're meaning-seeking organisms being forced into meaningless activity. The psychological dissonance is profound. When you can't stand small talk, you're often someone for whom meaning is so essential that meaningless activity feels psychologically painful. It's not that you think you're too good for small talk. It's that your psyche is oriented toward meaning-seeking in ways that make meaningless verbal exchange actually distressing. Studies describe introverted intuitives as having a tireless pursuit of meaning that shapes all their experiences. Let's also consider what Jung understood about psychological types and selective sociability. Jung never said introverts dislike all social interaction. He understood that introverts can be quite social and engaged when the interaction matches their type needs. An introverted intuitive might talk passionately for hours about ideas, patterns, meanings, psychological dynamics, all the content their dominant function engages with. The same person will be exhausted after 5 minutes of small talk. This isn't inconsistent. It's type-specific engagement. The conversation content matters enormously. People who can't stand small talk but who love deep conversation aren't contradictory or hypocritical. They're demonstrating how their type engages selectively based on whether the interaction activates their actual capacities and provides the kind of content their dominant functions work with. Jung himself could be quite social and talkative when discussing ideas and psychological matters that engaged his intuitive and thinking functions. But he found ordinary social conversation draining and often avoided it. There's also something profound about what Jung called the collective and how small talk serves collective function that certain individuals resist. Small talk is fundamentally a collective activity. It's about establishing and maintaining collective belonging, signaling that you're part of the group, that you share common ground, that you follow social norms. The content doesn't matter. What matters is the ritual of verbal exchange that bonds the collective. For people engaged in individuation, the process of becoming unique individuals, distinct from collective patterns, small talk can feel like being pulled back into collective conformity. It's the collective demanding that you participate in its bonding rituals rather than maintaining your individual separateness. When you can't stand small talk, you're often someone for whom individuation is important and for whom collective rituals feel like threats to your individual development. You're not being antisocial. You're resisting being absorbed back into collective functioning that would undermine your hard-won individuality. Jung emphasized that individuation requires some degree of separation from collective, and resistance to collective rituals like small talk is often part of this necessary separation. Jung also understood something about what he called active imagination and how it operates during apparent social inactivity. For introverted intuitives, what looks like doing nothing externally often involves intensive internal activity. Their imagination is constantly active, generating images, perceiving patterns, following intuitions. During small talk, this active imagination is forced to shut down. All attention must focus externally on the meaningless conversation, preventing the internal imaginative activity that is this type's natural state. People who can't stand small talk often experience it as forced interruption of their natural internal activity. They're being pulled out of rich internal worlds into impoverished external verbal exchange. The cost isn't just the energy of external engagement, but also the loss of the internal activity that nourishes them. There's also something crucial about what Jung called the thinking function and how it relates to conversation preference. Jung identified thinking as one of four primary functions, concerned with logic, analysis, and understanding. For thinking types, particularly introverted thinking types, conversation is valuable when it serves thinking, when it involves analysis, logical development, or intellectual exploration. Small talk doesn't engage the thinking function at all. There's nothing to analyze, no logic to follow, no understanding to develop. It's purely social emotional ritual that thinking function finds utterly meaningless. When you can't stand small talk, you're often a thinking type whose dominant function finds no material to work with. The thinking function sits idle and frustrated while you perform social rituals that don't engage your actual cognitive capacities. Jung himself was likely a thinking type, which contributed to his difficulty with ordinary social conversation that didn't engage intellectual or psychological exploration. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the shadow and how small talk can feel like shadow suppression. The shadow contains qualities and impulses that consciousness rejects. For many people who can't stand small talk, their shadow contains desires to be direct, honest, intense, deep, qualities that small talk explicitly forbids. Small talk requires suppressing shadow material that wants to skip the pleasantries and get to what actually matters. When you're engaged in small talk, you must suppress your shadow desires to be authentic, direct, and deep. You must perform the socially acceptable surface interaction while keeping your shadow's intensity locked away. This forced suppression is exhausting and feels false. People who can't stand small talk often have shadow material that protests against superficiality and performance. Their discomfort with small talk is partly their shadow rebelling against having to suppress authentic impulses in favor of social ritual. There's also something significant about what Jung called psychological boundaries and how small talk violates them for certain types. Jung understood that different people need different amounts of psychological space and different kinds of boundaries. For deep introverts and introverted intuitives, conversation that accesses their internal world requires trust and safety. They don't share their inner reality casually. Small talk creates a peculiar boundary problem. It demands engagement without depth, interaction without intimacy. You must be socially responsive without revealing anything real. For people who operate from depth, this split is uncomfortable. They either need real distance or real depth. The middle ground of engaged but superficial feels like boundary confusion. When you can't stand small talk, you might be someone whose boundary needs are clear, either genuine privacy or genuine depth, but not this uncomfortable middle ground where you're socially engaged but psychologically protected. The forced engagement without depth creates boundary confusion that feels intolerable. Jung also understood something about what he called compensation and what happens when small talk is culturally excessive. Jung observed that the psyche compensates for one-sided, conscious attitudes in cultures that have become excessively oriented toward surface interaction, toward constant socializing, toward performance and image. The unconscious compensates by creating intense aversion. When you can't stand small talk, you might be experiencing compensatory response to a culture that has become pathologically surface-oriented. Your psyche is compensating for cultural excess by creating extreme aversion that forces you toward depth and authenticity. This isn't personal dysfunction. It's healthy psychological response to unhealthy cultural one-sidedness. There's also something profound about what Jung called the self and how it communicates. The self The organizing center of personality communicates through feelings, intuitions, and bodily responses. When you experience visceral discomfort during small talk, yourself might be signaling that this activity doesn't serve your authentic development, that it's taking you away from, rather than toward, wholeness. People who can't stand small talk often have strong self-guidance systems that create uncomfortable feelings when they're acting against their nature or wasting energy on activities that don't serve their actual development. The discomfort isn't social anxiety. It's the self's way of saying, this doesn't serve you, this isn't your path, this violates your nature. Let's also consider what Jung understood about creative types and their relationship with conversation. Jung recognized that creative people often have unusual social patterns because their energy and attention are oriented toward creative work rather than social maintenance. For creative individuals, small talk feels like theft of creative energy and attention. The mental space required for creative work is invaded by demands for meaningless social interaction. When you can't stand small talk, you might be someone whose creative capacity is primary and who experiences social demands as interruptions of the internal creative processes that are your life's actual work. Jung himself was highly creative and protective of his creative energy, often withdrawn from social life to preserve the mental space his work required. There's also something crucial about what Jung called typological development and maturity. Jung recognized that in youth, people are often more socially conforming, trying to fit collective expectations. But with psychological maturity, particularly in the second half of life, tolerance for inauthentic or meaningless activity decreases. When you can't stand small talk, you might be demonstrating psychological maturity that has outgrown tolerance for surface interaction. You've developed enough to know what serves you and what doesn't, and small talk clearly doesn't serve your actual development or well-being. This isn't becoming curmudgeonly, it's becoming discriminating about how you spend your finite time and energy. Jung's own intolerance for meaningless social interaction increased with age as he became clearer about his actual work and needs. Jung also understood something about what he called the feeling function and how it relates differently to small talk. Jung distinguished between feeling as emotion and feeling as a rational function that evaluates based on values. For people with developed feeling function, small talk can feel wrong because it violates values around authenticity, depth, and genuine human connection. The feeling function evaluates small talk and judges it as valueless, as violating what matters. When you can't stand small talk, your feeling function might be protesting against activity that contradicts your core values around authentic communication and genuine relationship. There's also something significant about what Jung understood about anxiety versus exhaustion. Many people assume that disliking small talk means social anxiety, but Jung would distinguish between anxious avoidance and exhausted avoidance. Anxiety is fear-based, exhaustion is energy-based. When you can't stand small talk, you're often not anxious about it. You're exhausted by it. You can do it. You just recognize that it drains you disproportionately to any benefit received. This is typological exhaustion, not social anxiety, and conflating them misunderstands what's actually happening. Let's also consider what Jung understood about the relationship between type and culture. Jung recognized that cultures favor certain types over others. Extroverted cultures that value socializing, networking, and constant interaction make life difficult for introverted types. When you can't stand small talk, you're partly experiencing the friction between your type and cultural expectations. The culture insists small talk is normal, necessary, and valuable. Your type experiences it as draining and meaningless. This isn't individual pathology. It's type culture mismatch. Jung spent significant effort helping people understand their types so they could stop trying to conform to cultural expectations that violated their nature. There's also something profound about what Jung called the inner life and how it requires protection. For introverted intuitives, the inner life is rich, complex, and vitally important. Small talk feels like invasion of inner space by trivial external demands. You're being forced to bring attention outward to meaningless content when your inner world is where actual life is happening. People who can't stand small talk often have exceptionally rich inner lives that small talk interrupts and violates. They're not empty people seeking stimulation. They're full people protecting their inner richness from external triviality. Jung also understood something about what he called psychological economy and the principle of not wasting resources. The psyche operates economically, attempting to allocate resources wisely. For certain types, small talk represents terrible psychological economy. You're investing significant energy, attention, and time in activity that returns nothing of value to your actual psychological needs or development. When you can't stand small talk, you've often developed acute awareness of psychological economy. You recognize bad investments when you experience them, and small talk is consistently bad investment of your limited resources. This isn't being calculating or cold. It's being wise about resource allocation, which Jung considered a mark of psychological maturity. There's also something significant about what Jung called the transcendent function and how small talk prevents it. The transcendent function is the psyche's capacity to generate new understanding by holding tension between opposites and allowing symbols and insights to emerge. This function operates through internal processes that require mental space and freedom from external demands. Small talk fills mental space with trivial external content, preventing the transcendent function from operating. When you can't stand small talk, you might be protecting the mental space where your transcendent function works, where genuine insights and understanding emerge. The discomfort with small talk is your psyche, protecting its creative capacity from being crowded out by meaningless external chatter. Let's also consider what Jung understood about individuation and authenticity. Jung believed that individuation requires becoming increasingly authentic, increasingly aligned with your actual nature rather than social expectations. Small talk is fundamentally inauthentic. No one is speaking from authentic self. Everyone is performing social ritual. For people committed to authenticity, even necessary social rituals, small talk becomes increasingly intolerable. When you can't stand small talk, you've often developed to the point where inauthenticity, even socially required inauthenticity, feels wrong and draining. This is psychological progress, not social dysfunction. You're becoming less able to perform falseness, which Jung would see as movement toward wholeness. There's also something crucial about what Jung called extroverted versus introverted perception. Jung explained that extroverts perceive primarily through engagement with external objects, while introverts perceive primarily through internal subjective response. Small talk is designed for extroverted perception. It's about external objects, weather, events, observable facts. There's no room for introverted perception, for subjective response, for internal meaning-making. When you can't stand small talk, you're often an introvert whose perception naturally focuses on internal subjective response, and small talk gives you nothing to respond to internally. It's all external object with no internal significance. Jung also understood something about what he called psychological pain, and when social interaction becomes actually painful rather than just uncomfortable. For deep introverts and introverted intuitives, excessive external focus can create genuine psychological pain, not just discomfort. The nervous system registers the mismatch between natural orientation and demanded activity as distress. When you can't stand small talk, you might be experiencing actual pain from the forced external orientation that violates your internal orientation. This isn't being oversensitive. It's how your nervous system responds to activity that contradicts your constitutional makeup. There's also something profound about what Jung called the relationship with time and how different types experience it. Introverted intuitives often experience time non-linearly, engaged with patterns and possibilities that transcend immediate moment. Small talk is rigidly present-focused about immediate surface reality. This temporal mismatch creates discomfort. You're being held in immediate present when your consciousness naturally operates across time, seeing patterns, imagining possibilities. When you can't stand small talk, you might be experiencing temporal constraint that feels like being locked in a moment when your consciousness needs temporal freedom. Finally, there's something to be said about what Jung called acceptance of type and living according to your nature. Jung believed that psychological health requires accepting your actual type rather than trying to be a different type that seems more socially acceptable. If you can't stand small talk, acceptance means acknowledging this about yourself rather than trying to overcome it or judging yourself as deficient. It means recognizing that your type has different social needs and patterns, that you can meet social obligations when truly necessary, but that you shouldn't expect yourself to enjoy or be energized by interaction that contradicts your nature. It means finding ways to minimize unnecessary small talk in your life rather than forcing yourself through constant discomfort. And it means seeking the kinds of interaction that do energize and engage you: deep conversation, meaningful exchange, authentic connection with people who also value depth. In the end, why you can't stand small talk is multifaceted, but fundamentally about type. You're likely a deep introvert whose energy flows inward and who finds external-only focus exhausting. You're probably an intuitive type whose dominant function finds no material to work with in surface conversation. You're someone oriented toward depth rather than surface, toward meaning rather than pleasantries, toward authenticity rather than social ritual. Small talk is terrible energy economy for your type, demanding significant investment with no return. It forces you into persona performance without substance. It interrupts your rich inner life with trivial external demands. It violates your values around authentic communication. It prevents your creative and transcendent functions from operating. It keeps you on surfaces when your orientation is toward depth. It holds you in immediate present when your consciousness operates trans-temporally. And it represents everything about collective conformity that your individuation process requires you to resist. Carl Jung would not tell you to overcome your aversion to small talk or to develop better social skills for managing it. He would validate that your type genuinely finds this kind of interaction draining and meaningless, and he would encourage you to accept this about yourself rather than judging it as deficiency. He would help you understand that you're not antisocial or socially deficient. You're a particular type with particular needs, and small talk simply doesn't meet those needs. He would distinguish between necessary social obligations that you must sometimes fulfill regardless of preference and unnecessary small talk that you can legitimately minimize or avoid. And he would encourage you to seek the kinds of interaction that do engage and energize you. Conversations about ideas, patterns, meanings, psychological dynamics, creative work, anything that activates your actual dominant functions rather than forcing you to operate from your weakest capacities. Your inability to stand small talk isn't a character flaw or social dysfunction. It's a type characteristic of introverted intuitives and other depth-oriented types who find surface interaction genuinely draining and meaningless. Understanding this can free you from the guilt or self-judgment that often accompanies this characteristic. allowing you to accept your actual nature and structure your life in ways that honor it, rather than constantly violating it to meet social expectations that were never designed for your type in the first place. Jung himself lived according to this understanding, minimizing social obligations that drained him and protecting his energy for the deep work and meaningful interaction that his type required. Your discomfort with small talk is your psyche, telling you something important about who you are and what you need. And honoring that message is psychological wisdom, not social failure.